Well, we might get started. So thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon to explore this important topic of how we best keep young people in mind and in view within our service system responses. I'd just like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of Aboriginal people today. For me, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. And I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So once again, just introducing the topic. This is sorry, I've made a little mistake there, not the second in a three-part webinar series. This is the third in a three-part webinar series in which we've explored approaches to engagement and assessment of children and young people to encourage service providers to think about how we best keep children in mind and in view and include them within our service system responses in a meaningful way. The webinar series is part of the Child Wellbeing Project at the Centre that has been a partnership between the Centre and Family Safety Victoria. So I'm thrilled to have Lucy, Evangelista and Caleb Edelsten with us today. I'll introduce Lucy and Caleb. So Lucy's a therapeutic specialist within youth residential care at Uniting in the Gippsland region. Lucy has many years' experience working with children and young people across various roles, including within the Take Two program, intensive case management, education and youth work. Now, Lucy has also provided consultancy and training to residential carers in Uniting's therapeutic model of care. Lucy is a trauma-informed practitioner who engages in a multidisciplinary approach to assessment, intervention, care and support of young people with complex developmental trauma. And introducing Caleb, who's the current Senior Manager of Complex Client Services at Berry Street in the Southeast region of Victoria. His current role involves oversight of the intensive case management and adolescent support programs across Berry Street, Smallwell and Noble Park sites. Caleb also manages a multidisciplinary team that includes specialist youth family violence practitioners and other practitioners too. Caleb has 10 years experience working with young people, predominantly in the out-of-home care sector, across, again, a variety of roles, including residential care, case management, foster care, and targeted care packages. Both Lucy and Caleb have just a really wealth of experience working with young people, so I'm looking forward to hearing from them today, and both very passionate about what they do. I'll just touch on a couple of technical points. So the session's being recorded, and the recording of the webinar along with links to further resources will be emailed to all registered attendees after the session. So if you can't catch all of it today, there'll be a chance to rewatch or watch the session. There'll be a Q&A for the last part of this webinar, so please type your questions into the Q&A box as the session progresses, and we'll get to those during the last part of the session today. If you do experience any technical issues, we recommend leaving and rejoining, as this often resolves the issue. Yes, but hopefully it's all smooth today. So I'll stop sharing my screen and then we'll hand over to Lucy and Caleb to share their screen for a bit of a presentation.
For the little delay there. Hello.
Thanks, Lucy and Caleb. Fantastic.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you. So we are here today on Gunai-Kurnai country, just like to acknowledge that. In the space of our delivery of a presentation, we did think that it would be important to be quite generalised, just given that we have attendees participating from various different roles and spaces in the sector. In that instance, we acknowledge that everybody works within their own models and frameworks around their organisational requirements, but we felt that it was important that we came from a child-centred, strengths-based approach in the connection and engagement and support of young people, particularly adolescents in this instance. We do practice from a trauma-informed lens, which I think is vital, especially in the space of family violence, when a referral might speak to one instance, but we're generally connecting with children who have had experiences across their lifespans. We're going to draw on something that I've just referred to as the triple R principles here, which sits in a Bruce Perry framework, and the PACE style engagement. There may be degrees of familiarity amongst the group. So hopefully we meet the right brief around finding what works for everybody in the room, and that people can take some useful content away from it. So we've drawn on, and you may have seen on the previous screen, that there was a series of doors in the background, and we're using doors as a bit of a metaphor for that space of connection and engagement, and how it can be sometimes daunting to stand at the doorway and not know what's beyond it. When we think about our entry point and our engagement and connection with people, it is important to hold that environment and relationships are everything in the world that we live in, and how we know ourselves within it. So in that space of our own identity, it's in the experience of others and our connection with them that we come to know ourselves. In the environment around us, we come to know our degree of safety, a familiarity of our surrounds, our sense of belonging and place. This sense of identity and interaction, it builds on our esteem as to who we are in the world, our social concept as to what our talents and gifts are, what we're good at compared to others, and also that informs our self-concept. That space of environment and relationships is everything. It's everything in our experience through our lifetime. And I think one of the things that Caleb and I are very aware of is that interrelational element of our social experience is a two-way experience. So what we bring to our clients can be very different to what they bring to us. In our own relational experience, the hope is that as workers, we have that sense of our doorstep at the doorway having a welcome mat. So that experience of people being celebrated on their arrival, home sweet home, that experience of an environment that we can actually feel is sweet and we can actually feel safe and supported in. And the space that can be very different for the people that we arrive to.
Yeah, and I think that's, for me, you know, when engaging with children and young people, particularly in out-of-home care, but across the sector, it's important to note that our sense of safety and what we perceive as a safe environment is often not the experiences of the young people that we're working with. And I find, you know, the key to establishing a rapport and working with a young person is about, you know, understanding where they're at, what their needs are, and meeting them at their levels. So asking a child or young person to come into an unknown environment and sit across the desk from a professional for an hour and have a conversation about experiences that they're having in the home, they may not be able to commit to that level of engagement. So it's important to, you know, connect with them in things that are familiar, make them feel comfortable, try and establish that sense of safety as they come into the room, you know, be playful, accept who they are and their experiences, but also understand that their perception of the world around them is very different to the environment that you are inviting them into.
And I think that interrelational experience, especially with Caleb's mention there, is that space of it's inter-environmental too. We may arrive to the doorstep of a client and experience that vast difference in what their sense of place and home looks like versus ours. The same goes when they are attending our workplaces. It's a very different environment. They can feel like the stranger in the house and very othered just to walk through the door and see environments that are very different to their own. In the space of how the environment and relationship impacts us in our own lifetimes, I know that in the sector we have lots of people with lived experience, but I think the space of being professional in our workplaces is that we've arrived to a space where there may be lived experience, that we're in a recovery or post-trauma or post lived experience space, where we are able to bring reason and reference to what is typical versus what is not. So in that space of our client base, we have people who are impacted by trauma. And I'm sure many of the participants are aware of the enormity that trauma can have on development, how it can affect all systems of our way of being and knowing the world. It has neurological impacts, it has physical impacts, it impacts the way we communicate and communication styles. It also affects difference in all social spaces. So in school, perhaps being in a post-trauma shock can mean that you're not engaging in school in the way that might be expected and required of you. It is something that is all-encompassing, the impacts of trauma. So it's something to also hold in mind is that the children and the adolescents we engage with do not have the same faculties that we might anticipate a child to have, and that adolescents may stand in a young adult's body, but they will have ways of presenting that may sit in a much earlier age bracket when it comes to what we expect of typical development. So you might meet a 17-year-old who interacts at the age you might expect social competence of an 8-year-old. You may have that same 17-year-old present like a 2-year-old when they are escalated or dysregulated. So the image on the back of this, this slide, it looks at the door as a padlock, because you are someone that is part of a sector that the children that we support, and I'll often say children when I'm referring to adolescents because of that developmental impact on their capacity. But in homes where the system has been something that has often affected trauma in itself, we can arrive to a locked door and it can feel like the door is a padlock that we're shut out from. So one of the things that Caleb and I have spent quite a bit of time considering in our presentation is what is it that we can do to unlock the barrel of that padlock and have it open and potentially affect a doorway for us to enter through and connect and relate.
What I love about this metaphor that I can't personally take credit for because Lucy came up with it is that it goes both ways. And I think about the experiences of the children that come into our services or programs. When they're presenting to us, we can often present as that padlock door. So although, you know, we may get that sense of being locked out, that's also their experiences coming to us. It's really important to remember that when trying to build a rapport with a young person and establish that connection, is that they're often coming to us, you know, with that fight or flight response in an uncertain manner, you know, feeling locked out, feeling anxious, not feeling safe. And it's on us as the professionals that are working with them to be able to establish that sense of safety.
Caleb and I are separate speakers, but we're obviously presenting together. We've worked together in a space of working with complex youth in the past. Caleb has someone that has taught me a great deal in that space. In our work with complex youth, there's an enormous amount that you learn organically. And so I think where you might have some nerves and concerns around what it might look and feel like to engage with young people, knowing that over time your practice wisdom will evolve and you will have an enormous resource in your own experience to draw down on. And that's that sense of fearlessness in just being there, being available, holding in mind that as trauma impacts development, it also brings a child sometimes to a younger age. We know that often a child will arrive to us with a lot around them, a lot around the system's perspective of their risk, of the danger that they might present. And I think sometimes the bigger the story around a child, the bigger their story and the greater the need for them to be connected with, and the potential that in that developmental context, a child is often crying out for support and just not able to articulate it. So when it comes to initiating connection in that space of a door that's a padlock and how we might actually break through, connectivity is sometimes just about being there. Sometimes it's about persistence. Sometimes it's about noticing something that we might relate with. Oh, you know what? I had a doorbell that rang just like that. Even if it is just something that brings a sense of connection, you may not get when we think about what are they telling us. Sometimes it seems like they're telling us to F off. And often behind that F off is fear. So that space of someone saying, I'm like you, I used to listen to that doorbell when anybody came to the door when I was younger. Even though we get a very obstructed response, somewhere it sits with the child that person's someone who wants to connect with me. And that can be a huge relief if you're living in fear and stress.
I think what's important to remember too is that it often feels uncomfortable and unorganic connecting with an adolescent or a child in that way. And as Lucy so poetically put it, their responses on the surface are not always what we're seeking, but the vast majority of times, children or adolescents will respond to that. You may initially be met with an F off or whatever the language they choose to use on the day. But as that connection begins to grow and as you continue to persist in that relationship, they will naturally start to progress and to give you more and to connect with you over time. I think it's really important to remember, particularly for newer practitioners coming into the sector, that you won't always be met with children and adolescents that are there and ready to engage in your service. Most kids we work with are either pre-contemplative or referred into our program from somewhere else, and it's often a decision they don't have any autonomy over themselves. So it is really important to allow yourself to be uncomfortable in that space, and it can be clunky at times, but as you progress and as you get more experience doing that piece of work, you will notice that kids will respond. It's initially met with a barrier or a padlock, and then as you persist, that starts to break down.
Yeah, I think given that we've got attendees from various different spaces and places, something that's important to note too is the variation in a post-crisis response. So if you're in the crisis response space, the child can often really welcome and be very receptive to your arrival, because it's, thank goodness, there's change, there's something to pivot the difference of this enormous terror that I've just been through. And that child may welcome you, may hold you in high regard, may respond and interact appropriately. And it may be that the next time you see them, you get that same kind of seeming block. It may be the instance that if there's some delay in response, that you get the space that we're talking about, where they're sitting in what is a more normal style of communication in their experience of relationship and environment. So we've popped here a reference to Bruce Perry. Now, Bruce Perry is big in developmental trauma and bringing to the front of people's mind that complex development means that children will present differently to what is considered age typical, and that goes across all domains of experience. So he, in his RRR, has come up with those three letters for regulate, relate, and reason. It stands to be that when it comes to a connection evolving into rapport and a relationship of professional engagement, when a child is regulated, there is the opportunity to connect and relate with them. And when that relating develops into a relationship, then there is the opportunity to reason with them, to be able to affect ways of seeing, ways of knowing, ways of interpreting, to take a narrow field of view in their experience of environment and place and relationships and start to broaden it a little.
And what I love about this theme here is that once that relationship is established, you can start to reason with a young person, which can then help regulate them when they're in a period of crisis. So it really does, you know, it almost comes full circle in the importance of when a young person is regulated, that's where you build the relationship, and that's where you can start reasoning with them. And then you use that relationship to be able to regulate them at the next point of crisis.
Yeah. It's a curiosity too. Assessments take place across the entire time, that from the referral through to the entire engagement around how a young person is travelling and what we assess as their needs and their presentation. In that space, our own experience, our own presentation is also very important. And we can use this. You may have a workspace that has their own frameworks that we work within, but check in on yourself before you connect. Are you regulated? Are you in a position to relate, to hold the child at the front of mind, and be reasonable in your experience with them? Yeah. So Dan Hughes is another very big player in the space of complex developmental trauma and the impacts that it has on young people. In the acronym PACE, we have a wonderful way of relating. It's a way of, it's a style of communication. It's not a framework or a model in itself. So it's a tool within a framework in order to affect connection that's meaningful, to be able to almost therapize in a conversation. So to arrive with an idea that this child might need this knowing or this knowledge to support their experience and the way they navigate through. And we can use this as a way of bringing that to them. It's also something that we can use organically in our style of connection. When Caleb mentioned earlier that space of organically having that capacity, some people will find that they do look at what PACE is and say, oh, I already do that. But knowing PACE is important because it allows us firstly to affirm that our style of support is on point. But secondly, it's important from the framework of developing and evolving it too. So if you want to go through the acronym.
Thanks, Lucy. So the PACE acronym stands for playfulness, for P, which is very self-explanatory, and I think probably the hardest concept to get your head around, in that we're dealing with kids. You know, they may present as much older at times, but the vast majority of the young people that come into our services developmentally are quite young. And it's okay to be playful. It's okay to engage in, you know, some sort of banter or game with them as to establish that relationship and that connection. The next part of PACE is acceptance. And I think this is the key concept to PACE, in that we should always accept the young people that we're working with, regardless of the behaviour that we might be seeing. And Dan Hughes, I had the pleasure of seeing Dan live last week at the trauma conference, the ACF trauma conference, and he spoke about being in a session with a young person who spat in his face. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have experienced that before, but obviously none of us want to get spat at or spat on. And Dan Hughes articulated it really well about how he sat down with that young person, spoke through what had happened, and spoke about how he accepted him, he accepted his history, he accepted the trauma, but he did not accept the behaviour. And they were able to work through that together in a really therapeutic way. The next part of PACE is connection. You know, obviously establishing a connection with the young person is paramount to the work we do. Without safety in the relationship and having that connection, we're unable to do the work that we need to. And empathy, you know, being empathetic of the child that we're working with. Sorry, I thought Lucy was going to jump in there.
I have to jump in at one point, because you know what? I was thinking about connection and I forgot to put curiosity. My brain tapped in connection instead of curiosity. So my deepest apologies that is a typo, but possibly the biggest typo that someone could put in a presentation. Yeah.
I did notice it before, but it's fine. And also showing curiosity, being with the young person in their environment. And I can give many examples, but Lucy, I had the pleasure of managing Lucy for a few years, and she did such a fantastic job of being curious with young people whenever we met them. And I remember, we had a referral come in for a very complex 15-year-old boy who no workers had been able to establish any connection with. And we allocated him to Lucy. And at the time, people were saying to me, I'm not sure that's the best practitioner for him to be allocated to. But Lucy did such a fantastic job of being playful, accepting him, being curious whenever they connected with one another. And, he would walk into the room and she'd be like, oh, look, I love your shoes. Tell me about those shoes. And this kid would look at Lucy and go, you know nothing about Nike TNs. But just being there and being present and having that interest over time, that connection really flourished. And that young person happened to have his 18th birthday last week and had personally asked for Lucy to be invited along, although she left the organisation quite a few years ago. So I think that's a credit to the work that Lucy did in that space, and then her ability to use PACE as a model to be able to build that connection with him.
It's an interesting thing, because when we speak about that initial connection, I was introduced to this young chap on my second day, and Caleb drove me to the residential youth home that he was living in, and we were taking him out to purchase something from a previous event that he was requiring some things from EB Games, I think. Anyway, we got in the car. I was in the back seat. He was shotgun with Caleb driving, and Caleb maybe I was shotgun. Yes, I was. So I was in the passenger side of the front seat, and this young chap was in the back seat. And when Caleb let him know that I was his new worker, he was most affronted. I was feeling all chipper in my second day of the job with my first client. I was really looking forward to meeting him, and a bit nervous and a bit anxious, and it felt enormous. And the first thing he said was, I told you I didn't want an effing woman worker. And then I made a playful comment about being short-haired and being able to speak with a deep voice if you wanted. And that was met with, he seethed, and it was a big expletive that came out then. And you know what? Just holding empathy, just holding that space of accepting that was where he was at, and thinking internally, oh gosh, how am I going to get past this? And that we did. It's quite remarkable, I think, that the affection that we hold the kids that we work with professionally in, and I think this young fellow will sit in my heart for all of time, even though that's in the context of a professional connection. So we have also the space of empathy, which speaks to just holding that we accept that the young person is presenting the way they do because of the life that they've lived. And I think something that Caleb and I have both said across time is that if I was to be born into that person's body, have the exact same experiences, live the exact same life, you can bet my responses would be exactly the same. It is not to say that often a presentation that can be really quite sharp and abrupt is actually directed at us. It's trauma presenting. So taking things personally is not helpful, because often it is just the case that you could be my face, you could be Caleb's face, you could be Anna's face, and the person would have the same response to the information being provided. The way we perceive external stimuli is impacted by trauma significantly. I think it's important, that space of playfulness. It doesn't mean you have to play a game. Caleb mentioned at the start, all different styles of being playful. So that lightheartedness in engagement. Even when news is hard, you don't make jokes of it, but there might be an appropriate moment in time to make light or to notice something else to break up the hardship, but never shifting a child away from processing the experience that they may be sharing. Acceptance too, in accepting that a child's presentation doesn't mean we accept the behaviour, is something that Caleb said to me quite a few times. I also think that acceptance is accepting that the child is impacted, that of course they present the way they present because they have that experience of impact that has impeded their capacity to develop in a normative way. Our curiosity, it's thoughtfulness without confrontation. It's in giving the child an invitation, being curious and allowing them to take us to what is next for them or to choose not to. Caleb's got a lot he can say around consent with the child, and I know that was one of the things that we spoke about in building up to this presentation. Shall we speak on that now? Or?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to. I guess for me, having worked in the sector for 10 years now, and I've worked predominantly in statutory programs across that journey, children and young people often don't have a lot of autonomy around the services that they're engaged with and the relationships that are forced upon them. So one thing that I've always asked my staff to do and to hold in mind is to seek the endorsement or seek the input from the child or young person, ensure that they're ready and willing to engage in the service, and it's okay if they're not. So let's say a young person's been referred to CASA and attends their first meeting for a CASA appointment, and the clinician sits there and asks, this is what we're going to go through today, and these are the reasons for the referral. Are you happy to discuss them? It's okay if they say no. Have a general conversation with them. Give them the opportunity to end the session on their terms rather than us forcefully going through that process and risking them shutting down and not wanting to engage at all, or not wanting to come back into the service. I think it's really important to seek their acceptance of the referral first and foremost, and to empower them to be able to begin and end a session on their own terms rather than having to go through that process. And we think about window of tolerance and all of those things. Some young people that we work with have about 10 minutes where they can sit in a space and actively engage. And then after that, they're unable to sit there and actively engage with us. And that's okay. If we can get 10 minutes a week out of a session, I think that's fantastic. And just encouraging them and accepting that that's where they're at, and, being curious as to how you might be able to then gradually increase that over time. I think that's really important. These things don't often come natural to people, and it does come with experience and time. But I think if we are led by children and young people at all times, you'll find 9 times out of 10 you will get good outcomes. It may take some time, some experience and some practice, but being led by the child and being child-centered is always going to hold you in good stead moving forward.
Yeah, something that I think is really important in what Caleb said there is that space that we arrive to a child with an idea, with a system that's told us this is what's needed, this is what's required. And sometimes it's the child's first time hearing about it. So we may have been in 6 different meetings and heard about it across 2 weeks while we planned and supported how the child was going to have this notion introduced to them. And then we arrive to the child and say, this is happening. And they're expected to just roll into that space of accepting what the 17 people that have met on different occasions at different tables have deemed would be possible. That doesn't happen. And in that space of what the child is telling us or what the adolescent is telling us, but I will always say child because we have to hold the child within, is going to be potentially oppositional. But just inviting the notion or the idea, you might hear them speak in a complete oppositional way to something that you've introduced. but you will be transparent and provide the child with a clear understanding of what's being provided, why, what it will look like, how you might support them through that process. And in that, you may well find that you get a call a week later going, how come you haven't given me a call about and what's happening with? That's because they've had an opportunity to process. So gently just reintroducing and affirming an idea and a way through can be quite significant in supporting a child to the next space.
I think, and just quickly before we move on to the next slide, the other thing that's really important is respecting their knowledge and their experiences. You know, the young people that we work with often know the systems that we work within far better than we do. And due to their developmental age or any other risk factors, we tend to make decisions for them rather than with them. And I think it's important to listen to what they're saying, respect that, and then build that into our practice, because often they know what they need. And it's important to be guided by that.
Yeah. I think if life's been a catastrophe, it's easy to catastrophize. So I just want to highlight in that space of pace is that you'll see in the background, the door's actually starting to take more form. You can't recognise that it's a padlock anymore because you've taken the time to notice when the child is ready for a relationship to form in order that you can reason with them and have that wonderful interaction. In that space, you'll see the little circle that was a lock has turned into a space for correspondence. And what you'll find is as you connect with the child, especially one that's been complex and difficult to engage or challenging to engage, you'll have people come to you for advice and support and to consult on how that child might be supported. But in that allows the child to be gifted with strategies that are modelled in the way that they can develop their own identity in the social world that they're living in and their interaction with you. This one's curious because you've made that connection and then the child rejects you. Boom. But I thought we were fine.
I love this slide. And, you know, I think for any practitioner or worker that works alongside children and youth, it's really important to understand when there's been a relational rupture, which is going to happen, the ability to be able to repair that is paramount to the work we do. You know, I've worked with children and young people who from day to day, depending on what's happening, have hated me and, you know, I'm the worst person in the world and they never want to see me again. But the next day are contacting me and wanting me to come out and outreach to them and show up. And I think it's really important to understand the importance of those relational ruptures and then being in the space to be able to repair them. And it goes back to what Lucy was saying earlier too, around understanding our own internal cues. You know, are we in the right headspace to be able to do that work? And then connecting with the child and acknowledging that there's been a rupture and talking through it and the experiences from both sides, you know, and being open to feedback on how we can change our own practice to better support that young person. You know, I think it's really important and often something that we lose sight of because we come in not wanting there to be any ruptures and we want to be able to get it perfect from the beginning and be able to support these children and meet all of their needs. The reality is that that's not how it works and that's not what's going to happen.
Relational repair is enormous when it comes to modelling to a child what social experience can look like and what relationships can look like. I just want to highlight in our door metaphor, this padlock has keys next to it. In the work you've done with your finding the regulated space to relate and to develop a platform for reason, and in pace and how that evolves and develops a relationship, you have effectively created keys for the padlock to support the child through. Another thing in the assessment space and that space of organic assessment that happens around a child when they are perhaps presenting in a dysregulated way is what's behind it. Is there a pattern? Is it always after they've been at mum's that they seem to present? As you get to know a child, you will start to wonder around presentations and their context and if it is showing or telling you something that might contribute to an assessment space.
I think it's important to understand just touching on family and the wider networks of the children and young people that we work with, their experiences as well. Lucy and I were talking offline before around the impact of intergenerational trauma and how we work with family members that may not be in support of the work we're doing, or may want to be present in every connection that we're having with their child for fear that we're going to impact their relationship or turn their children against them. I've heard it all over the journey, and I think that's really important. I can give an example. I was actually on the phone to a father yesterday. We case manage both of his daughters, and his experiences have been quite significant in that, he was a child in care himself, and now he's got two children that are in care. So he's, really reactive to anything that happens to his children, understandably so. And he'll often call services and get quite upset and angry and abuse staff. And the systems that are supporting his children often then disconnect from him and don't want to engage with him for fear of being yelled at. I think it's important to understand that, his journey is very similar to the experiences that are now being played out for his children. And we need to understand that when engaging with that person or with that family member, and acknowledging that, they've had these lived experiences, and there is a fear there that's associated with our service. And it's on us as the professionals to be able to build a connection and rapport, not only with the child, but with the parent or the caregiver as well, so that they're feeling safe and comfortable in the relationship.
I will be super quick here because I know that we need to allot time for some questions. It's a topic that we're both very passionate about and could possibly talk about different elements across time. But holding that it's their story, not ours, that we've been deigned to connect for a purpose, that in building rapport, we find ways that we can strengthen their experience and strengthen their connection and engagement. We do this with safety, we do modelling, and in that we do capacity building for their own empowerment. Our connection is limited, and so if we can affect filling in that space of a door that seems to be a bit more inviting, then we've done amazing work in the way we've connected with the children. That also speaks to this. So we will have a quantified reason that we're engaging. We will need to do the work. When you get a referral, you don't just jump straight in. You actually look at what is around that referral. Is your program going to accept it? Who's it going to be allocated to? As Caleb said before, the consideration around where the matching is done between a worker and a child can sometimes be important. Sometimes if you just don't gel, you just don't gel. And it may be that that's not a reflection of your capacity as a worker. It may be that that child's just going to work better with your colleague rather than yourself. Their story after our work is their unique story. So his story or history is his story, not yours. So you don't need to carry their story on your shoulders. It's their unique journey, and that space of the work we do sometimes is unseen. It may be that it's long after we've been and gone that they are actually experiencing their life, their healing, their growth, their development. But change happens in a moment, and there is potential that at 35, they might remember that worker that connected with them when they were 14, who always said, just whatever you do, just keep believing in you and keep brushing yourself off and keep trying, because persistence will get you there. There'll be some little key potentially that you give them to take forward with them.
Thanks so much, Lucy and Caleb. Just give me a second. I'm just going to plug my headphones in.
Better not start talking again. No, that's fine.
Sorry, I just needed to block out the noise of my puppy chewing on shells, because that's going to interrupt us. Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. It's really rich, and I just particularly sort of, get a lot out of hearing your practice examples or, case examples, which really bring the information and the thinking to life. something that stood out to me is that message to, really give it a go, be courageous in interactions with young people, as they really need us to move through any awkwardness or hesitation in order to support them. Yeah, everyone out there, please type any questions into the Q&A box now. We've got a little time. And just a question from me, I guess, to continue us on. I really loved hearing some of, I suppose, the sort of ideas around making that connection with young people and, starting conversation. Yeah, it'd be great to hear a bit more on that, if you've got some more examples or thoughts there, particularly if there isn't much time, if you might only have a couple of meetings or opportunities to interact with the young person.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. It's a really good question, and it's probably something in the conversation we were having offline earlier. That's, for me, something that's happened organically throughout my career. Presenting to people, as people will be able to tell from today, is not my natural strength, and certainly not something that I've held my hat on. But I've often been able to naturally build connection with children and young people throughout my career, and it can be as simple as, and I always use Lucy as the example for new workers that come into the program, acknowledging anything, whether it's a watch, a pair of shoes, a t-shirt, and using that to form the basis of a conversation. For practitioners that are lucky enough to be able to go out and outreach to young people, if you get a young person in a car and you allow them to choose the music that you're going to listen to for the trip, I guarantee you'll get that entire trip a conversation started and be able to build a connection from there, because kids naturally find safety and relationships and connections through music. And so showing interest in the music that they listen to, and it doesn't matter what it is, I don't know if Cursor is still a thing, but back when I started as a case manager, Cursor was quite big with the young people that I worked with. Wasn't my cup of tea, but showing an interest in Cursor and having a background and an interest in hip hop, I was able to start to form connections with young people through that. And I think, that's really important. That probably hasn't answered the question, but that's what I've learnt into.
It certainly has. And I think,
yeah, definitely,
in the space of ongoing engagement and ongoing connection, that invitation into a vehicle, in my field now, I call it parallel processing, but it's also got the containment of the vehicle. It's got the white noise of the engine kind of in the background. It's got that space of not being as confronting to be side by side to someone than it is to be face to face and having someone engage you front on. There's so much in that. In the space of initial engagements, I think thinking pace is being applied as a really brief intervention for connection. So if I'm using pace to connect, then that playfulness, that acceptance, that curiosity, that empathy, bringing in the space of whether it's an observation, whether it's a, gosh, did you hear that noise? Oh, did you see that bird? Just some sort of observation that draws someone in without any judgment, without any inference or reference that might have them feel defensive, because someone who is trauma impacted can feel defensive, even if you feel like you're giving them a compliment or being very kind. It is quite dramatic, the impact that trauma can have. So drawing down on things in the environment, drawing down on things that might have oh my goodness, I grew up with a dining table just like that. However, there's also a possibility that you might hit a trigger. It's okay, just reset and try again. But if you pace with the intention to connect, you'll find that without overthinking it, you invite yourself to engage and you invite the child to feel the invitation. It's a curiosity too, in that space of balance. When I've had rap going in the car and needed an opportunity to engage, I did that whole, when I was your age, we listened to Public Enemy. And I put on a song saying, you've just got to listen to this. Think, you'll know that I was like, I had street cred when I was 15. I might be an old lady now. I didn't need to do that, but it's something in me and my sense of the child approving of me, which is really interesting. We don't need to seek approval. We need to seek a space of safety and connection. But in that instance, I got kiboshed because it was like, oh my God, this is SHIT. And it really, old rap music is really slow compared to new rap music. Being okay with that and being accepting of it, fine. Sometimes the efforts don't work, but you just, it's all right. Do exactly what you might tell a kid to. Hold the experience, feel it, pick yourself up and keep on. Obviously, that's a very generalized way of looking at life and not what we would necessarily do in an intense therapeutic situation, but a conversation is not an intense therapeutic situation.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy and Caleb. And I guess that's where sort of the repair comes in that you were referring to. It that could happen even, within a short space of time. It doesn't necessarily mean you're sort of coming back a week later or, doing that repair later on. So, how might that sort of look again in within a briefer interaction? Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, we're just reading the
great, yes.
Through.
Anna.
Oh, yes. Oh, shall I read that one out then? Yeah.
Thank you.
No, great. So, it's two questions. Great. We can. I'll just do them one at a time. So, what simple regulation strategies do you recommend for young people?
I would say you absolutely need the relationship to be suggesting regulation strategies. And I understand that some people will have one episode of connection. So it mightn't be the case that you get the opportunity for that episodic kind of, I see them across a 6-week period, or they are referred to me until the referral is no longer needed. But we can still quantify that and we can still fast track it. So taking the time to actually introduce and gain the child's trust, well, they may not trust you, but at least if they feel safe, they may go there into a space of trust. So firstly, if the child is elevating, co-regulation is probably the most important thing. And through co-regulation, we model rather than tell. Some kids have got no capacity to regulate.
I think what is important to, and I really like this question, what is important to note too is that if there is a relationship there and if there is safety in that connection, often young people will tell us what that strategy is. I've had experiences where young people say, I need to go for a walk. I had one young man that I worked with for years who was very complex and his thing was fishing. And he would literally ring me up on the phone and say, I don't know what you're doing, but you need to drop what you're doing because I'm having a shitty day and I'm about to assault workers and I need to go fishing. And that's what we would do. And that was his experiences. So it varies. And it is quite difficult if you're in a formal setting with a young person and you don't have that relationship there, you're probably not going to be able to identify that strategy at the time. I think over time, though, as that connection builds and as they continue to come into your service, you'll start to identify what some of those strategies are.
Yeah.
I think things like balls, anything that a young person can use with their hands to distract them is helpful, whether it's slinkies and, is it magnetic sand?
Yep.
What it's called? Yep. That's anything like that. I think that's a wonderful tool to have on hand. It may not work, but I do find that when children and young people are able to take that energy and put it into something else, it will help reduce their heightened senses and then help support them to regulate.
Yeah, I think what Caleb says there is so on point. When we talk about Bruce Perry as being a big player in this area, Sensory domains are often the strongest point for our kids. They will have a deficit compared to what's typical, but when it comes to their regulation, their cognitive or their emotional spaces, sensory skills and developmental processes will almost always be their highest. So being able to be sensory, have sensory play, can be remarkable in supporting them to a calmer space. A calmer space may not look like a meditative space, but it will be calmer and just perhaps that perfect amount to bring them down from that escalated space. I think too, where a kid doesn't have capacity to regulate because they are in a heightened state of arousal, because they've lived in a stressed space and never actually had those skills modelled to them, sometimes allowing dysregulation to play out, having a proximity to them so they know that you're in the space as a safeguard or as someone that's got them and holding them in mind, and waiting until the other side of it to say, you know what, I noticed things seemed really intense for you there, and that it didn't seem like that was what you wanted or that was something that you could control. I can help you with that. And just giving them an assurance. Doing it in the moment will get nowhere except feeling challenged and challenging you back and potentially aggressing. But taking the time to do it afterwards, when they are in a space of wondering, why do I do that and why can't I control, and affecting who they feel they identify with themselves in the social and environmental world, is really reassuring and supports your capacity to be someone that's safe for them. When it says, how do you compassionately tell a person that you accept their history? Sometimes telling them isn't the thing. Sometimes, I'll give an example very quickly. I've had a young person in the car screaming at his mother, then screaming at his sister, having both of them on two phones and being the intermediary, who he's screaming too, but he's the go-between between the two spaces. I didn't comment on his behaviour in my car. I think he may have also punched at the window because he was very perplexed. But I'd said, wow, that's a lot to manage. That's a lot to handle, being the in-between and the middleman between that enormous conflict. You're like someone who could do a role like mine. I have to juggle a whole lot of different challenges and competing experiences. And you know what, in a bit of time. So it's acknowledging that things were over the top, that behaviours weren't necessarily appropriate. But within that, there was a strength for him to be able to go, oh, I am the negotiator between my family, even though we don't want a child to be the negotiator. But drawing down on that strengths-based acknowledgement of his capacity was really important. And then that invited me to pull back to that, to have future conversations, because he already felt safe and affirmed in that context.
I think often those 2 points, and I know it's 2:30 or just gone past 2:30, so we're wrapping up the session, but I think often those 2 points go hand in hand as well. You know, when a young person is dysregulated, in the moment, there's no point in trying to address the issue or address the behaviour, but as they regulate, either through co-regulation or by themselves, reaffirming that relationship and that connection, and acknowledging, you know, it's great that you're here with me today. However, you know, I don't like being spat at, or I don't like having things thrown at me, you know, as I'm sure you don't. Is there another way that we can, you know, display that we're upset, or is there, you know, a safety word that we need to end the session early so that you're not feeling like you need to get to that point, and showing some curiosity as to what triggered the behaviour in the first place, and also acknowledging that you want to keep them in that space and you want to maintain that connection with them and that relationship, but you're not there to be spat at or have things thrown at you, or punched, or whatever the behaviour is at the time.
Keeping messages of safety is a really important thing. So that experience, when a child's dysregulated, they don't feel like they have control over their behaviours, and we might have conversations with them and they might do it again because it's outside of their locus of control to regulate those behaviours or stop themselves from having their fear and their terror and their trauma spit out of them. So being able to, I think when Caleb said, I don't like being spat at, it wasn't saying you spat at me. So that's really important too, is shifting. It's not an accusation, because a child in trauma will feel that, but also using safety rather than a consequence for behaviours. So saying, I was worried about your safety when I noticed, or I saw this happening, is a really lovely way, because it says safety is the key here, and I care about you, and I care about you being safe and not harmed.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's a pity we don't have more time. You know, such an important topic and rich conversation that we're having. We could definitely, you know, go for another hour, couldn't we, at least? So we better finish up there. Thank you so much, Caleb and Lucy, for your time and for sharing your experiences and expertise with us today. You know, I think there's a lot we can all take away and go and think about further, and you know, that's the idea, to, you know, get us all thinking a bit more about this aspect of our work and how we can how we can really ensure we're engaging with children and young people and including them in a meaningful way in our services. And thank you to everyone who joined us today, and thank you all for the important work you do with children and young people.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks so much. See you. Bye.